Cleveland, Ohio, a city known for its resilience, its blue-collar roots, and its unforgiving winters. But in 2009, it became the backdrop for one of the most horrifying crime stories in American history. It all started with a simple call, a missing person report filed by a worried family member. Tonia Carmichael, a 52-year-old woman, had vanished without a trace. Her mother had gone to police, desperate for answers, but like so many cases involving troubled women from marginalized communities, it didn't seem to raise much concern. She was told, maybe she just left on her own. No urgency, no investigation, just another case filed away. But Tonia wasn't the only one who had disappeared. For years, women had been vanishing from Cleveland's Mount Pleasant neighborhood, a quiet, working-class area that had been slowly crumbling under economic hardship. Abandoned houses lined the streets. Businesses had shut down, and the community had become a place where people learned to mind their own business, a place where secrets could stay buried. Then on October 29, 2009, everything changed. Police officers arrived at a rundown White House on Imperial Avenue with an arrest warrant for Anthony Sowell, a 50-year-old former Marine. They weren't there for murder. They weren't even looking for missing women. They were investigating an accusation of sexual assault from a woman who had managed to escape his home just days before. When officers knocked on the door, there was no answer. Sowell wasn't home. But what they did find would haunt them forever. As they stepped onto the porch, a putrid smell filled the air, a foul, almost unbearable stench that neighbors had been complaining about for months. Some had assumed it was a backed-up sewer. Others thought it was coming from the nearby sausage factory. But as the officers entered the house, they quickly realized the source of the smell was something far worse. Inside, the air was thick with decay. Flies buzzed in dark corners. Garbage and filth littered the floors. And then, in one of the rooms, they made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the department. A decomposing body. Then another, and another. The further they searched, the more horrifying it became. Bodies were buried beneath piles of clothes. Others were left in the open, as if forgotten. A skull was found wrapped in a paper bag, casually placed in a corner like an afterthought. The house on Imperial Avenue wasn't just a home. It was a tomb. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. Reporters swarmed the scene, cameras flashing as horrified neighbors gathered outside. People who had lived next to Sowell for years stood in stunned silence, tried to reconcile the quiet man they had seen every day with a monster that had been hiding in plain sight. But the horror was just beginning. Police had only scratched the surface of what lay inside that house. The full scope of Sowell's crimes was still unknown, and one terrifying question lingered in the air. How many more bodies would they find? The officers at the scene were stunned. The stench of decay was unbearable, thick and suffocating, clinging to their clothes and hair. They knew they had stumbled upon something far worse than they had anticipated. One officer, his face pale and eyes wide, took a step back from the open door and gagged. "We need backup," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Detectives soon arrived, their expressions shifting from curiosity to horror as they stepped inside. The living room was in complete disarray. Trash piled up in corners, liquor bottles littered across the floor, and a worn-out mattress stained with substances no one dared to identify. But it wasn't the filth that made their stomachs churn. It was the unmistakable signs of death. Flies buzzed furiously in the stale air, circling over dark stains on the carpet. The officers' boots crunched over something brittle. Bones, perhaps. Then, as one of them shined a flashlight near the staircase, the beam caught something that sent chills down their spines. A human skull. It sat partially buried beneath a heap of old clothes and newspapers, its hollow eye socket staring blankly, as if mocking them for arriving too late. The detective leading the investigation took a sharp breath and turned to his team. "We need forensic specialists in here, now." As officers secured the area, a team of investigators methodically combed through the house. In the basement, the discoveries became even more horrifying. Large plastic bags, duct taped and stacked against the walls, emitted the same overwhelming odor that filled the air upstairs. An officer carefully peeled back the tape of one bag, and as the contents were revealed, the room fell silent. Inside was the decomposed body of a woman, her limbs contorted in unnatural angles. Her face was unrecognizable, but one thing was clear. She hadn't died peacefully. One by one, the gruesome discoveries piled up, bodies hidden in crawl spaces, skeletal remains behind the walls. The nightmare seemed never-ending. As the forensic team worked tirelessly, the detectives turned their focus to one pressing question. Where was Anthony Sowell? Neighbors reported that they hadn't seen him for days. Some recalled an eerie silence coming from the house, as if the place itself knew its master had vanished. Others swore they had spotted him lurking in the alleys at night, his eyes darting around nervously. But no one knew for sure where he had gone. Then, just as the officers began to wonder if they were dealing with a ghost, a chilling revelation emerged. One of the victims had managed to escape. A woman, terrified and shaking, walked into the police station, her voice barely audible as she spoke. "He tried to kill me, but I got away." The room fell silent as officers leaned in to listen. "He's still out there," she whispered, "and he's not done yet." The day after police searched Anthony Sowell's house on Imperial Avenue, Cleveland was already reeling from the gruesome discovery of decomposing bodies inside and outside his home. But the horror was far from over. As investigators combed through property, carefully removing evidence and marking new areas of interest, the true scope of Sowell's crimes was just beginning to unfold. By midday, the team had uncovered 4 more bodies and skull, bringing the total count to 11. The smell of death lingered in the air, a nauseating reminder of the nightmare that had taken place within those walls. Detectives moved with grim determination, realizing that the house itself had become a tomb for Sowell's victims. Every room seemed to hold secrets, hidden horrors that spoke of unimaginable suffering. Forensic experts worked tirelessly, collecting DNA samples and attempting to identify the victims. Many of the remains were in advanced stages of decomposition, making the process difficult. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. These women had suffered greatly before their deaths. Signs of restraint, bruising, and blunt force trauma painted a picture of brutality beyond comprehension. Meanwhile, the biggest question loomed over the city. Where was Anthony Sowell? The moment officers realized he had vanished, an urgent manhunt was launched. His face was plastered across news stations and newspapers. Flyers with his mugshot were distributed throughout Cleveland, urging residents to stay vigilant. His name echoed on every media outlet. Anthony Sowell, the Imperial Avenue Strangler, is still out there. The city was gripped with fear. Women refused to go out alone, and families locked their doors, afraid that Sowell might strike again. The police set up a tip hotline, receiving hundreds of calls from concerned citizens who thought they had spotted him. Some reports placed him in different parts of Cleveland, while others speculated he had fled the state. But despite the efforts, Sowell remained elusive, slipping through the cracks like a phantom. Authorities feared that with his military training, he would be able to evade capture indefinitely. He had served 6 years in the U.S. Marine Corps, traveling to locations like Japan, California, and the Carolinas. His knowledge of survival tactics made him a formidable fugitive. He knew how to disappear, how to avoid detection, and most chillingly, how to kill without remorse. 3 days passed, and the fear in Cleveland only intensified. Every shadow felt threatening. Every news update brought more anxiety. Was Sowell hiding in an abandoned house? Was he planning to kill again? As the days stretched on, desperation mounted within the police force. If they didn't catch him soon, there was no telling how many more lives would be lost. Then, on October 31st, 2009, a break came in the case. A bartender working near downtown Cleveland had just finished his shift when he noticed a familiar face wandering the streets. The man looked disheveled, his clothes dirty and his movements erratic. The bartender's heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. "I think I just saw Anthony Sowell." The dispatcher wasted no time. Within minutes, a SWAT team was deployed to the location. The city held its breath as heavily armed officers closed in, moving toward the suspect with careful precision. The streets were quiet, too quiet, as they surrounded him. Then, in a sudden, tense moment, one officer shouted, "Hands in the air! Don't move!" Sowell turned to face them, his expression eerily calm. And then, The manhunt begins. The moment authorities realized Anthony Sowell had slipped away, the city of Cleveland was thrust into a state of fear and paranoia. Law enforcement wasted no time issuing a nationwide alert. Sowell's mugshot appeared on television screens, newspapers, and social media. His face was plastered on every street corner, warning the public that a dangerous predator was still on the loose. The police set up checkpoints across the city, stopping cars and questioning residents. Detectives combed through Sowell's known hangouts, tracking down old acquaintances, former co-workers, and anyone who had come into contact with him in recent months. SWAT teams raided abandoned buildings, crack houses, and rundown motels, believing that Sowell might be hiding in places familiar to him. But with every lead, they came up empty-handed. As the search intensified, fear gripped the city. The media ran sensational headlines. The Cleveland Butcher's still out there. Where's Anthony Sowell? Monster on the loose. Women, especially those who had lived in the area, refused to go outside alone. Parents kept their children indoors. Even seasoned detectives admitted that they had never seen anything like this before. A serial killer, known for his cruelty, had vanished into thin air. Detective Greg Whitaker, one of the lead investigators, couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were missing something crucial. He sat in his office, staring at a large map of Cleveland pinned to the wall, each pushpin marking a place significant to Sowell. Imperial Avenue was at the center, but what caught his attention were several dots scattered downtown. "We're looking in the wrong place," Whitaker muttered, rubbing his temples. He flipped through Sowell's past records again, his eyes landing on a key detail. Sowell had frequented bars downtown, even after his factory job ended. Could he be hiding in plain sight? A possible sightings and a break in the case. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. On October 31st, 2009, Halloween night, an employee at a bar near East 9th Street spotted a man who looked eerily familiar. He was wearing a black hoodie, his face partially concealed by the dim lighting, but there was no mistaking that scar on his cheek. The employee had seen the news reports and immediately grabbed the bar's phone. "Yeah, I think Anthony Sowell is in my bar," the bartender whispered urgently. Within minutes, multiple police units surrounded the area. Officers moved swiftly, entering through both the front and back exits to ensure there was no escape. Customers were ordered to remain in their seats as officers scanned the room. Then, in the farthest corner, slumped over a table, they saw him. Sowell barely reacted as the officers approached. For a man who had terrorized the community, his demeanor was unsettlingly calm. When they placed him in handcuffs, he didn't resist. He didn't say a word. But as they led him out into the flashing lights of waiting news cameras, a chilling smirk crossed his lips, almost as if he knew something they didn't. What was he hiding? Had he planned something even more sinister before his capture? The truth was about to unravel in the courtroom, and it would shake the city to its core. As Anthony Sowell sat in the courtroom, staring blankly ahead, the weight of his crimes finally came crashing down. The walls of justice were closing in, and there was no escape. The jury had spoken, guilty, on 82 counts, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, and abuse of a corpse. The sentence was inevitable, death. When the judge pronounced his fate, the room erupted in mixed emotions. Some family members of the victims wept, others nodded solemnly, and a few even shouted in rage, knowing that no punishment could ever truly make up for the horrors Sowell had inflicted. Yet, in that moment, justice had been served, at least on paper. But the story was far from over. Despite his death sentence, Sowell used every legal loophole available to him. He filed appeal after appeal, delaying his execution for years. The victims' families, who had waited so long for justice, found themselves caught in another nightmare, one in which their tormentor remained alive, his case lingering in the system, reopening old wounds with every new motion filed. While Sowell sat behind bars, the city of Cleveland struggled with the fallout of his case. The police department faced intense scrutiny for its failures. How had they ignored the countless warnings? Why did they release him back in 2008? After Gladys Wade's desperate cries for help, the community demanded answers. Lawsuits were filed, protests were held, and calls for reform grew louder. One glaring issue stood at the heart of the controversy. The victims, all of them were black women, many struggling with addiction, homelessness, or difficult pasts. Society had ignored them, and when they disappeared, their cases were dismissed as unimportant. It was a painful truth, and one that could not be ignored any longer. In 2011, 2 years after Sowell's arrest, 12205, Imperial Avenue was demolished. A crowd gathered outside as a bulldozer reduced the house of horrors to rubble. Neighbors, activists, and victims' families stood side by side, watching as a physical embodiment of evil was erased from the Cleveland skyline. But even as the house fell, the memories remained. The pain, the suffering, and the lives lost could never be forgotten. Years passed, but the wounds left by Sowell's crimes never fully healed. In a cruel twist of fate, he never faced execution. On February 8, 2021, he died in prison, not by lethal injection, but from cancer. He slipped away quietly, without suffering, without ever facing the same terror and pain he'd inflicted on his victims. For some, it was an injustice. For others, it was simply an anticlimactic end to one of the most chilling cases in Cleveland's history. Yet, despite his death, the questions remained. Were there more victims? Had Sowell killed before 2007, perhaps even before his first known attack in 1989? Some believe the 11 bodies found were just the beginning of a much darker reality. The full extent of his crimes might never be known, leaving the unsettling possibility that some families would never find closure. The case of Anthony Sowell serves as a grim reminder of the evil that can lurk in the shadows and the devastating consequences of a system that fails to protect its most vulnerable members. How many lives could have been saved if the police had acted sooner? How many other predators are still out there, hiding in plain sight? What do you think? Should the justice system have done more to stop him earlier? Could his crimes have been prevented? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story chilling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime documentaries. Stay safe, and until next time, remember, monsters are real, and sometimes they live right next door.